The year was 1347, and Europe trembled under an invisible terror. Ships arrived at Sicilian ports carrying blackened corpses, their bodies swollen with buboes that oozed pus and blood. The air carried whispers of a pestilence that no priest, physician, or king could halt. The Black Death swept through villages and cities like a scythe cutting wheat. Families who sat down to dinner one night could find half their number dead by morning. Priests blessed the dying only to collapse themselves before reaching the next bed. The panic spread faster than the disease itself. Medieval medicine offered no answers. Bloodletting, charms, and prayers proved useless as entire parishes were emptied. People turned to explanations rooted in fear, divine punishment, poisoned wells, or the work of Satan's servants. In the search for a scapegoat, suspicion fell upon those already living at the margins. Jews, lepers, and other outsiders became targets of growing paranoia. Their customs, their separateness, and their resilience in certain areas made them stand out. Whispers began to spread in taverns, churches, and marketplaces that these groups had poisoned the wells with powders and herbs to bring death upon Christians. The fear was not new. Jews had long been blamed for everything from crop failures to child disappearances. Lepers, too, were viewed as cursed beings, marked by God's wrath. But now, under the shadow of the plague, these old prejudices hardened into deadly accusations. In 1348, the first mass accusations took shape in southern France. A few men, driven by terror and rage, claimed to have seen Jews dumping mysterious powders into village fountains. The rumor took hold like wildfire, and within weeks mobs were forming. In towns across Provence and Catalonia, Jews were dragged from their homes and beaten in the streets. Their houses were searched for evidence of poison, bags of herbs, jars of medicine, even prayer scrolls twisted into proof of conspiracy. None of it was real, but fear cared little for truth. The authorities, desperate to maintain order, often encouraged the accusations rather than calming them. Local lords and magistrates saw an opportunity. By allowing violence against Jews and lepers, they diverted blame from their own failure to protect the people. Worse, they could seize the property of the accused. In Toulouse, chronicles tell of lepers being rounded up and forced to confess under torture. Their bodies were stretched on the rack until bones cracked, or their fingers were crushed in iron screws. Broken and bleeding, they confessed to crimes they never committed, simply to make the pain stop. Public spectacles became common. In some towns, Jews were paraded through the streets in chains, spat upon by crowds who cursed them as servants of the devil. Bonfires roared in the marketplaces, not only burning books, but also consuming living men, women, and even children. The flames offered no cure for the plague, but they gave the people a fleeting sense of control. As bodies burned, cheers mingled with the stench of roasting flesh. Parents who had lost children to the plague screamed that justice had been done, blind to the truth that they were slaughtering the innocent. Meanwhile, the plague raged on. Executions did nothing to slow the tide of death. Rats carried fleas from village to village, unseen and unstoppable. Yet still the killings spread, carried on waves of fear and superstition. By late 1348, the violence had leapt across borders. In Switzerland and the Rhineland, entire Jewish communities were accused of conspiring to poison wells. Torture chambers filled with cries of agony, as prisoners were whipped, burned, and broken on wheels. Each confession extracted under torment fueled the cycle of blood. In Strasbourg, the city council at first tried to protect its Jewish citizens, but pressure from the guilds and the mob proved too strong. On Valentine's Day of 1349, 2,000 Jews were herded into a wooden structure and set aflame. Their screams rose above the crackling fire, while their killers rejoiced as though purging evil. The spectacle shocked even some chroniclers of the time, yet others wrote of it as divine justice, proof that God's wrath could be appeased by punishing his enemies. The mindset of fear turned neighbors into executioners, convinced they were saving their own souls. For lepers, the fate was equally grim. Across France and the Low Countries, leper colonies were raided. Inmates were burned alive, drowned in rivers, or hanged in public squares. Their twisted limbs and pale skin became evidence of their supposed pact with Satan. Outsiders of every kind, foreign merchants, travelers, beggars, were swept into the frenzy. In the eyes of frightened townsfolk, anyone unfamiliar could be a poisoner. Strangers were beaten to death without trial, their corpses left in ditches as warnings. Behind all of this loomed the silence of the church. Some priests and bishops spoke out, urging mercy, but many others stoked the fires of hatred. Sermons thundered that Christendom was under siege from within, that the blood of the innocent dead could only be avenged by rooting out the guilty. By the end of 1349, Europe had seen massacres in dozens of towns. Some communities of Jews and lepers were wiped out completely, erased from the map. Survivors fled into forests, mountains, and across borders, carrying nothing but terror in their hearts. The true horror was that the plague cared nothing for these killings. Death swept on, claiming peasants, priests, nobles, and kings alike. The scapegoats burned, but the disease did not fade. Fear had consumed the innocent, yet the shadow of the Black Death still darkened Europe. This was only the beginning of a nightmare, for in the years to come, torture and execution would become ritual answers to every wave of disease. Entire generations grew up believing that salvation lay in bloodshed. The myth of poisoned wells would haunt Europe for centuries, and in the cries of the dying and the silence of the dead, the truth was buried, that the real killer was not the Jew, nor the leper, nor the outsider, but the pestilence itself, invisible and relentless. The tragedy was that fear had made monsters out of men. By 1349, fear had hardened into frenzy. Across Central Europe, whispers of poisoned wells became louder than reason. Town after town prepared the scaffold and the pyre, convinced that purging Jews, lepers, and outsiders would drive the plague away. In Basel, Switzerland, hysteria boiled over. The city council, under pressure from angry guilds, arrested hundreds of Jews. They were locked inside a wooden barn built on an island in the Rhine. On a cold January day, the barn was set ablaze. Flames devoured the building, and with it the lives of nearly the entire Jewish community. Not a single bucket of water was thrown to douse the fire. Instead, the townsfolk stood watching, many shouting hymns and psalms as if cleansing their city of demons. Children screamed from within, but their cries were drowned out by chants of "God wills it." Strasbourg followed weeks later. The city had long harbored tension between its Christian citizens and its Jewish population. Though some leaders argued for protection, the guilds pushed for blood. On February 14, 1349, a wooden platform was erected in the marketplace. There 2,000 Jews were herded together. Those who converted to Christianity were spared, but most refused. They clung to their faith even as guards stripped them of their belongings and bound them. The crowd jeered, demanding punishment for imagined crimes. The platform was set alight, flames roaring beneath the victims' feet. Smoke rose into the winter sky as families burned alive, their screams mingling with the crackle of firewood. Witnesses described it as both horrifying and holy, a sacrifice to appease God's wrath. The massacre left a permanent scar. Entire neighborhoods were emptied overnight, houses seized by Christian neighbors who had once shared meals with those now dead. The wealth of the murdered was redistributed, feeding greed as much as fear. Elsewhere, similar horrors unfolded. In Mainz, one of the largest Jewish communities of Germany, mobs stormed through the streets. Armed with axes and torches, they butchered men, women, and children. When defenders resisted, the attackers burned entire quarters to the ground, killing thousands. In Cologne, hundreds of Jews were locked inside a synagogue. The building was set ablaze, its sacred scrolls burning alongside the worshippers. Survivors who escaped the flames were cut down in the streets. No trial, no mercy, only blood. The torture chambers overflowed. Prisoners were stretched on racks until their limbs dislocated, their mouths pried open with iron gags to force confessions of poisoning. Some were boiled in cauldrons, their flesh peeling away while crowds gathered to witness. Others had molten lead poured down their throats. Even children were not spared. In several towns, sons were tortured to confess against their fathers, daughters against their mothers. Broken by pain, they mumbled whatever their tormentors demanded. Each false confession was recorded as proof that the Jews and lepers conspired against Christendom. The executions were staged as spectacles. Cities built grand scaffolds in their main squares, decorating them with banners of the cross. Trumpets blared as victims were marched to their deaths, bound in chains. For the frightened masses, the killings became theatre, a grim ritual of false purification. Lepers faced equally cruel punishments. Rounded up from their colonies, they were dragged before courts that had already decided their fate. Some were blinded with hot irons, their eyes gouged out as a warning. Others were hanged in rows along roadsides, their twisted bodies left to rot in the open air. Foreigners, too, paid the price of being strangers. Traveling merchants, peddlers, and beggars were accused of carrying secret poisons. They were beaten, mutilated, and stoned to death in marketplaces. Their corpses were dragged through the streets, spat upon, and left unburied. The Church's voice was divided. Pope Clement VI issued bulls declaring that Jews were not responsible for the plague. Yet his words rarely reached the towns where mobs had already decided guilt. Local priests often fanned the hatred, preaching that Christendom must be purified of its enemies. For rulers, the massacres offered opportunity. Seizing Jewish property enriched city treasuries and noble coffers. Debts owed to Jewish moneylenders were wiped away in fire and blood. Greed marched hand in hand with terror, ensuring that few stepped forward to defend the condemned. The plague, meanwhile, raged on undeterred. Families who cheered at executions still buried their children days later. Kings and peasants alike succumbed, their skin blackening, their lungs filling with pus. The myth of poisoned wells did nothing to stop death's march. Yet the massacres continued. In Erfurt, in Worms, in Speyer, each city echoed with the same cries. Thousands were slaughtered, burned, or drowned. Riverbanks ran red, and gallows forests sprouted on the edges of towns. Fear had become a contagion deadlier than the disease itself. Chroniclers of the age recorded these horrors with chilling clarity. Some mourned the loss of entire communities, noting how Europe's Jewish population was cut in half. Others wrote with approval, convinced that the fires had pleased God. The truth was buried beneath ink and ash. Those who survived lived like hunted animals. They fled across mountains into Poland, into the Ottoman lands where rulers offered some protection. They carried with them not just grief, but the memory of betrayal by neighbors they once trusted. The Black Death had unmasked Europe's darkest impulses. Torture and execution became tools not only of fear, but of greed and hatred. The innocent were destroyed, and with them, centuries of Jewish life in Central Europe were reduced to ashes. But the nightmare was not yet over. The plague still raged, and the hunger for scapegoats would not fade easily. More towns, more victims, and more horrors awaited in the years to come. By the early 1350s, the Black Death had claimed tens of millions of lives. The plague's first great wave receded, leaving Europe scarred and hollow. Entire villages lay abandoned, fields untended, and churches empty. Yet the memory of the massacres burned as deeply as the disease itself. Where once vibrant Jewish communities had stood, only ashes remained. In Basel, Strasbourg, Mainz, and countless towns, their synagogues were reduced to rubble. Houses that had belonged to Jewish families were now occupied by their former neighbors. Wealth had changed hands, but at the cost of humanity. For the survivors, life was exile. Fleeing across mountains and rivers, Jewish families sought safety in the east. Poland's King Casimir welcomed them, offering refuge when much of Europe had turned into a graveyard. In the Ottoman lands, rulers accepted them as skilled traders and physicians. The flight reshaped Europe's map. Communities that had lived for centuries in France, Germany, and Switzerland were wiped out, while new ones rose in Poland and the Balkans. Yet the trauma of betrayal never left the exiles. They carried with them the stories of fire, torture, and abandonment. Lepers who survived fared no better. Their colonies, once tolerated, were now marked for suspicion. Many were destroyed outright, their inmates drowned or burned. Those who remained alive became wandering beggars, shunned as living reminders of God's supposed punishment. Foreigners and outsiders, too, learned that they could be hunted at any time. Trust had dissolved, hospitality was replaced by suspicion. A traveler entering a strange town could be accused of poisoning wells before he even set down his pack. Fear made strangers into enemies. The torture methods used during the plague years left a chilling legacy. Iron boots, racks, wheels, and boiling cauldrons had proven effective at forcing confessions. false though they were. These instruments did not disappear after the plague. They became fixtures of Europe's justice system for centuries to come. The memory of burning platforms and mass executions also reshaped how cities dealt with crisis. Whenever famine, disease, or disaster struck, scapegoats were sought. The idea that outsiders carried poisons or curses lingered long after the plague's shadow lifted. The Church, for its part, struggled with its own contradictions. Pope Clement VI's bulls declaring the Jews innocent were remembered, but so too were the sermons of priests who fanned the flames of violence. The silence of many leaders became complicity. Faith itself bore the stain of blood. Among the common people, guilt and fear mixed uneasily. Some chroniclers tell of townsfolk haunted by nightmares, hearing the screams of those they had burned. Others reported strange omens, storms, fires, or visions, interpreted as punishment for killing the innocent. Yet few dared to speak openly against what had been done. Children grew up with the memory of executions etched into their minds. For them, the sight of Jews burning in marketplaces or lepers hanging on roadside gallows was part of ordinary life. Fear had been taught as tradition, shaping generations to come. The myth of poisoned wells spread across borders. Even in places untouched by the massacres, rumors persisted that Jews and lepers were plotting to destroy Christendom. When smaller outbreaks of plague returned in later years, violence threatened to rise again, though never with the same ferocity. The Black Death did more than kill bodies. It killed trust. Communities that had once traded, celebrated, and mourned together were split forever. Bonds between Christians and Jews were shattered, replaced by suspicion that lingered long after the disease had passed. And yet, in the shadows of destruction, stories of courage emerged. In some towns, Christians risked their lives to hide Jewish neighbors, smuggling them to safety. A few priests spoke out, condemning the massacres as sins against God. Their voices were rare, but they burned like small candles in the darkness. Still, the larger narrative remained one of betrayal. The massacres became woven into Europe's history, remembered not as shame, but as divine justice. Chronicles recorded the burnings as victories against evil, shaping the prejudices of future centuries. The survivors rebuilt, but the wounds never healed. Jewish families in Poland and the Ottoman Empire grew strong again, yet they passed down tales of Strasbourg and Basel as warnings. Memory itself became a form of survival, teaching each generation what had been endured. Europe, however, never truly faced its guilt. Instead, it carried forward the tools of torture, the hunger for scapegoats, and the belief that suffering could be explained by human betrayal. The seeds planted during the Black Death would grow into future persecutions, pogroms, and trials. The plague eventually faded, but the legacy of fear remained. The real killer had been the pestilence carried by fleas and rats. Yet the story Europe chose to tell was one of conspiracy and betrayal. Innocence had been destroyed because truth was too terrifying to accept. The Black Death's shadow stretched far beyond the 14th century. It reshaped not only Europe's population, but also its conscience. In the fire and blood of those years, humanity revealed its darkest instinct, the need to find someone to blame when death came knocking. The tragedy of the massacres was not just in the lives lost, but in the lesson unlearned. For centuries afterward, Jews, lepers, and outsiders would continue to live under suspicion, marked as threats in times of crisis. The plague had passed, but its poison lingered in the human heart. Thus ended one of history's darkest chapters. The Black Death had claimed the guilty and the innocent alike, but fear had multiplied the suffering. Europe emerged smaller, haunted and forever changed, not only by the pestilence that killed millions, but by the cruelty it unleashed upon itself. Subscribe for more.